The next opening we're going to look at is called the Slob Defense. It begins with pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and instead of black playing pawn to e6, which we saw in the Queen's Gambit, black plays pawn to c6, which signifies the Slob Defense. This opening is an attempt to keep this light-squared bishop free along this diagonal, unlike the Queen's Gambit, which blocks that bishop in on the second move here with pawn to e6. That bishop can't get out. The other purpose of this pawn to c6 move is that it prepares to capture the c4 pawn and then later try to hang on to that pawn by playing pawn to b5. Because if you remember in the Queen's Gambit, it really wasn't possible to hold on to this c4 pawn. So if white isn't careful, black is actually able to win this c4 pawn and then defend it with b5. Black has to be careful and not attempt either maneuver prematurely, otherwise white can get a big advantage. For example, if the game continues, knight to f3, developing the knight in preparation for castling. Black does the same with knight to f6, knight to c3, and then let's say the bishop tries to come out now, then white can simply take this pawn, and if pawn takes, the queen can come here attacking this undefended pawn. And it's very difficult for black to try to defend this pawn without maybe losing this pawn. For example, if the queen comes here defending the pawn, then white can take the pawn here, and if the queen takes, the knight can take the knight with tempo, and whatever he does, he can recapture the queen, and he wins a pawn. And a pawn is a pawn in chess, and with good play and without compensation by black, which he doesn't have here, white should be able to go on and win the game. The same is true if black tries to capture that pawn a little too early. Let's back up here. So if play continues with knight to f3, and then black tries to take this pawn right away, and then hoping he can play b5, for example, say white plays pawn to e3, and he plays b5 to try and defend this pawn, which was being attacked by the bishop, white can start chipping away at these pawns, and there's really nothing that black can do to prevent losing a pawn. So let's say he tries to defend again, pawn takes. He can't take this way because the rook can capture the rook, which is undefended. So let's say he takes this way, then we chip away at this pawn with the threat of regaining the pawn here with pawn takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes. Of course, these aren't the only moves, but there's really nothing black can do to not lose a pawn or to incur other weaknesses in his position in his attempt to try and save that pawn. So black really needs to develop his pieces more before he can attempt either maneuver. Development of your pieces takes precedence almost over any other maneuver in the opening. Now let's look at a variation where black successfully gets his bishop out. So let's set up the board here and get back into the Slav position. d4, d5, c4, c6. We have the Slav, and we continue to develop knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3. Now let's say black takes the pawn. Now white has to be careful here because black is now really threatening to play b5, so he can play pawn to a4 to stop this. And now the bishop can come out to f5. And then on the next move he can regain his pawn by playing bishop takes c4 here. Notice that black can't play pawn to b5 because the knight is here defending that square, so if he takes, he'll lose the b pawn, and then probably he'll lose the c pawn as well. So let's back up to the original position here where he doesn't play b5. Black can continue to develop with pawn to e6, letting the bishop out. White can capture the c4 pawn. The bishop can come to b4, pinning the knight. And now both sides are ready to castle, and we have a game, and either side can win. Another variation that black can use, starting with the Slob defense, is called the Semi Slav, and it deals with the problem of this light squared bishop in another way. So let's set up the board, and it starts out the same as the Slav. We have c6, which indicates the Slob defense, knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, and now e6, which signifies the Semi-Slav defense, and e3, knight on b to d7, and if the bishop comes to d3 right away, then black will play pawn takes, bishop takes, and now b5, chasing the bishop back and actually opening up a diagonal for the light squared bishop to b7. This is a very rich and complicated position and is as popular as the Slob defense. So now let's look at a couple of games and see how the Slav is played out in actual play. By playing certain move orders, the games can transpose into various openings. So in this game, white starts out with knight to f3, black plays pawn to d5, white plays d4, knight to f6, c4, and we have some kind of queen's pawn opening here. But now we have the Slav with c6. And from here there are different sub-variations that can play out, as we'll see in this game. Knight to c3, and pawn takes. And now black is threatening to push the pawn to b5, defending that pawn, trying to hold on to that extra pawn. So white prevents that by playing pawn to a4. And now black plays bishop to f5, which is called the Czech variation. And it prevents the immediate push of e4, and it gets the bishop out, which is often the problem in queen pawn openings. And now white plays knight to e5, which is the Kraus attack, because he wants to get his pawn back. The knight challenges the knight grabs the pawn, the knight challenges the knight again, and the knight runs back, keeping pieces on the board, making things more complicated and reducing the chance for a draw. And now black plays a5, preventing this pawn from chasing the knight away. And now white plays f3, threatening to push e4, chasing the bishop back and getting a really strong center. There's really nothing he can do about that. So he slides over, attacking the knight. The knight trades, knight takes back, and e4, and white has a very strong, huge center now. And the bishop has to run. White develops the bishop for castling, e6 to let the bishop out, and he castles. And the bishop attacks the knight. White develops the bishop along the diagonal here. Black castles. The queen slides up, x-raying this undefended pawn, defending the knight. White will have the option now of either taking back with the queen or with the pawn. Queen slides to c7, eyeing this pawn, maybe looking to gang up on it. The king slides over, vacating the square. As I mentioned in another video, whenever a piece moves, it allows other pieces to occupy that space, and as we'll see, it's done in preparation to defend this pawn. Rook slides over, x-raying the queen. Now that allows this knight to swing into here, because this pawn would be pinned. So the queen gets out of that x-ray, and the bishop slides back, defending the pawn. Rook develops on the open file, where perhaps this file will become open and this rook will become more useful than it was here. The same with this rook, defending this pawn again, and maybe looking to push at some point. And now the bishop does slide over and put some pressure on this pawn. Attacked twice, but defended twice. The bishop slides to c4, becoming more active along this long diagonal here towards the king, towards this d5 square. Maybe at some point after these trades, the bishop will be here and already attacking this pawn twice with the queen. The pawn advance is trying to open up the king side over here. The knight slides over, perhaps to help out on the king side. Queen slides up now to become more active, to allow the rooks to slide along on the back rank. And now that the knight is moved, there's no longer this threat of the knight sliding in. Bishop slides up, leaving this pawn defended only once, and it's still attacked twice. And now we can see some more reasons for this knight coming here. This is a lure. It looks like if the bishop takes, this pawn can advance, and then this bishop would be trapped, and the king would be able to win it on the next move. So it appears. The rook slides over for reasons unknown to me at the moment. Bishop slides back, eyeing this pawn, putting some pressure on it. So if the queen moves, the bishop could capture that pawn. So the rook slides over, defending the pawn. The queen slides over, threatening to penetrate enemy territory here. Get on the king side. And black prevents that. Now the knight slides up, attacking the bishop, the undefended bishop, putting pressure on this pawn. So black decides to trade that off. Queen takes, and bishop takes. And white has achieved the bishop pair, which is a slight advantage now, because the bishops are faster than the knight in open positions. Bishop defends this pawn again. Bishop slides back, defending this pawn, putting pressure on this square, should the knight slide in. The knight slides to b8. Let's see where he's planning to go. One well-known middle game strategy is to place your pieces on outposts in enemy territory, and those are squares that can't be attacked by pawns. So you see in two moves, 1, 2, the knight can actually occupy this square, and he'll be safe there, and he won't be able to be harassed by pawns. And he'll be in enemy territory, where there are more targets. The king slides over to try and get into the game, become more active. So the knight does slide in here. Bishop backs off, maybe in preparation to allow this rook to penetrate after these pawns are traded. I don't know. So the knight takes this outpost. The bishop slides to f4, which allows him to penetrate enemy territory here. And another middle game strategy is to try to get your bishops outside the pawn chain. So if he comes here and here, he'll be outside the pawn chain where he'll have more scope. He won't be blocked by his own pawn, and he'll be attacking this pawn. And black moves here. He didn't see this maneuver. You know, the clock is ticking, and you don't see everything in chess, no matter how good you get. These are strong grandmasters playing this game. So the clock might be ticking, and as your time runs out, you notice less. And the bishop attacks the rook and does get this diagonal here. Rook attacks the bishop, and the bishop slides in. Now he's outside the pawn chain, defending this pawn, putting pressure on this pawn. You want to maximize the usefulness of your pieces. They should be attacking and defending. And as a result, they're more powerful than when they're just sitting somewhere doing nothing. And it puts pressure on the opponent's position. And when you get enough pieces in play, now he can slide his rook here and actually double attack that pawn, put two attackers on it, and win it. The knight slides back, maybe to become more useful. Actually, here he wasn't doing much. Maybe he's thinking about stopping the rook from coming here. But he left this pawn undefended in the process. He blocked the defense by this rook. The errors begin. The pressure is mounting on black's position. Knight slides back, exposing this bishop, and he defends with the pawn, because if the bishop ran, then the rook could take this undefended pawn. And now white has a big advantage with this extra pawn. In the hands of good players, that's enough to win the game, all else being equal, if the opponent doesn't get compensation in some way. So he pushes, allowing this bishop out, and possibly trying to win this pawn, attacking the rook. He could pick up this pawn in the process. This rook would have to run. And white pushes. Let's see, he's got 1, 2, 3 men on that square and only 2 defenders. But there's a light squared diagonal towards this king and a light squared bishop that can attack here. So if black tries to win this pawn, for example, let's say he takes, bishop takes. Now he could actually play rook takes, and the bishop attacks here, and he loses the rook, and he'll be up a piece because of this pin. That's why black didn't play that. He instead played king to h7, getting out of that, and now this threat is actually here. So white defends the pawn. The knight slides to a6, mainly because he doesn't have any other squares he can go to, and at least he's attacking the pawn. Maybe he's hoping white will capture the knight. Eventually white will try to figure out a way to get a passed pawn because he has an extra pawn. That's what you do with your extra pawns when you win a pawn in a game. Pawn to h4, slowing down the activity on the king side. King tries to get into the game as well, defending this pawn. Black king slides over, maybe to defend this pawn at some point, get off the back rank. I'm not sure. And the bishop backs off. Maybe there's a little bit of a waiting game that black is playing here, waiting to see what white's going to do, how he's going to convert his advantage, his material advantage, hoping he'll make a mistake in the process that he'll be able to capitalize on. I'm not sure. The bishop slides to d3. Let's see, he leaves this pawn undefended, so there might be a little trick here. So if the pawn takes, the pawn would recapture with check. And let's see, let's go through this a little bit. Pawn takes, check. And let's say he pushes this pawn. Now the bishop can come over and defend. And he would have his passed pawn. That may be it. There may be more tactics here that I don't see at the moment. But let's back up to bishop d3. And he played knight to b8. Black's position is cramped. And white advances the pawn. Trying to open up this diagonal to the king. I see. Pawn takes. And the pawn advances. Now he's got his passed pawn. Why can't he take it? Why can't the rook just take that pawn? Because if he takes it, he throws in a discovered check here. And we'll get at least the rook exchange if the rook takes the bishop. Then we have 2 rooks, and that's very powerful. And then the rook could slide here, attacking the bishop, and then and the knight, and then maybe slide his bishop here. Probably win a piece. So let's back up. So he pushes the pawn. He doesn't take it, but plays bishop to b3, attacking the rook and the pawn. The rook slides up, which allows the bishop to capture this pawn, but he doesn't do it. He moves the king up to get out of this potential discovered check, and the rook attacks the bishop, almost encouraging him to take this pawn, but he doesn't do it. Let's see if we can figure out why. Let's say if he takes the pawn, then that gives white this square with check. The king would have to run. Let's say he runs up here, and then the bishop could attack the rook, and he's trying to, and then the bishop could attack the rook, actually winning the rook, or at least getting the exchange, because the rook can't move here, 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 or here. That's why he didn't take the pawn. So let's back up to the position where the bishop runs back to e6. Now the bishop backs off, defending the square and getting ready to challenge this bishop. perhaps. Oh boy, this poor knight, hoping for something. White attacks the knight. So black takes, pawn takes, attacking the knight. The knight runs, and if the rook captures the knight, the rook can capture the bishop. But white runs, defending the pawn, and now there's pressure on the knight, right? He's attacking the knight. The knight has to do something. So he pushes the pawn to defend the knight, which was the fatal error, because he plays rook takes knight, pawn takes, and now this pawn advances, and there's no stopping it without losing a piece in the process. This rook can't move up without being captured by the bishop. There's a threat to advance this pawn on the next move, and then he would have to give up the rook for the pawn, maybe a whole piece in the process. If he captures here, the pawn will take, and he'll have two passed pawns. So black resigned here. Game over. So in this game, the Slav defense, the Czech variation, lost to the Kraus attack. But it was a tense struggle, as you could see, and the game could have gone either way.